Josh, welcome back, and thanks for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure.
So, tell us about your book, The Commingled Code, Open Source and Economic Development. What did you examine in it, and what were your findings?
Well, our motivation for writing this book was really very much a sense that the discussion around open source tended to be very polarized, in the sense that there were some people who were champions of open source and some people who were highly critical of open source. And it seemed that in some sense the discussion had been so extreme, positions had been staked out that there wasn't really that much room for reasonable discussion. And our spirit of this effort was to say, let's try to go out and really identify some evidence in terms of how people are developing and using open source, not just in the United States, but really around the world, and see what kind of patterns we see there. And it very much was in that spirit of trying to do empirical exploration along with then bringing some economic logic to try to understand and piece out what the patterns are telling us.
So we'll say bipartisanship, if you will.
Absolutely.
These polls. Okay, so in this look at open source today that you talked about, you mentioned that the role of corporations is evolving. In what way? Is it going to be a mixed source world? What kind of evolution are we going to see in your mind?
Well, I mean, certainly one of the most striking patterns that you do see in the evidence has to do with the, as our title suggests, the commingling that takes place. In the sense that when you look both at users and at producers, how often you see firms essentially both engaging in the open source and the proprietary world. In many cases, firms which are users will have a complex array of software, including some which is open source and some which isn't. In the case of producers, you often see that many things go hand in hand with each other. So you may not only see firms doing, for instance, on the operating system side, some programming things which are proprietary and some things which are open source and the like. So there's a much deeper set of interconnections and ties than might initially meet the eye.
And in terms of that evolution, where do you see it eventually taking the marketplace? Where will this evolution stop? Or will it just keep going?
Well, that's a great question. I think that what seems clear is that there is a sense in which the linkages between the open source and proprietary worlds are, if anything, deepening over time. So I think the one thing that's very much is certain is that one does have this sort of deep interconnection between the worlds of proprietary and open source software. I don't see any evidence that's easing, and in point of fact, you can even make a case that, if anything, recent events have led to a deepening of those ties and connections. And given that extent of ties, I would not be surprised to see even more interconnection between the world of proprietary software on the one hand and open source on the other, particularly if there's a understanding on the part of policymakers in terms of trying to make it conducive to those kinds of interactions.
And to your point about policymakers, you say we need policies that will facilitate both cohabitation and competition. What should those policies look like?
Well, I think it's easier to say what policies shouldn't be. And I think we've certainly seen a lot of interest on the part of governments in any number of countries in terms of basically creating either rules in terms of procurement that say one kind of software must be bought, or else in terms of, tilting the table in some sort of extreme forms to make it particularly favorable to one kind of software or the other. Certainly one of the things that was quite striking in our survey evidence was that whether you looked at firms that focus primarily on open source or focus primarily on proprietary software, you saw very much of a preference for neutrality in terms of saying we want to have policies that encourage software development and software use, but not which tilt the table one size or one way or another. That being said, there's clearly areas, and I think that you can point to areas like competition policy, making sure that no firm has too much of an advantage or uses their position to get excessive leverage, or areas like policies regarding standardizations and in terms of ensuring, openness in terms of the standardization process that I think are important areas that will facilitate both a healthy open source industry as well as a healthy interaction between open source and proprietary software.
Josh, thank you so much again for joining us today. It's great to have you.
My pleasure. Thanks again.